I'm the Director of Regulatory Affairs here at RCA. I've been with the company about 3 years, but I've been in the industry for a little over 15, dealing with everything from your basic Class 1 devices all the way up to your Class 3, submissions in the EU, US, Health Canada. With that, more pre-submissions than I dare to even try to count. So looking forward to providing some more information on that today.
Hello, my name is Anita Michael. I'm the Executive Regulatory and Compliance Expert for RCA and Principal Consultant. I've been in the industry now for 23 plus years. I've worked in small and larger pharmaceutical companies as the Vice President of Quality and Regulatory. Prior to that, I worked for the FDA for 16 years. I was their pre-approval manager and also the global pharmaceutical expert and ran most of their inspections on the East Coast through Division 1. I've been in over 300 companies and helped position companies for approvals with pre-market approvals, BLAs, NDAs, ANDAs, and implementing the six-system QMS for industry. So happy to be here today.
And I'm Thor Rollins. I've been with Nelson Laboratories for getting close now to 23 years. My background is in biocompatibility. I'm an ISO expert on TC 194, the committee that writes the ISO 10993 standards. So if anybody wants to talk about biocomp afterwards, I always love to do that. So right now my role is our VP of our medical device segment, which I'm in charge of kind of making sure that we're growing in the way that we should our medical device testing, that we can meet our customers' needs.
All right. Well, first and foremost, I want to thank you for joining us today. I know that regulatory requirements aren't exactly fun or exciting for most of you, so I know your time is valuable, so I sincerely appreciate you guys joining us. So let's get into it. What is a pre-submission? Do we have the next slide? Perfect. So a pre-submission provides the opportunity for a submitter to obtain FDA feedback prior to an intended pre-market submission. It's done through a formal written request for feedback from FDA, which will be provided in the form of a formal written response, and if the submitter determines it's appropriate, also with a meeting. The meetings can be face-to-face or they can be virtual, really depends. The program is entirely voluntary, so I should note that you don't have to do the pre-submission. However, it can provide manufacturers with a clear regulatory guidance and comprehensive understanding of your requirements and what you need to do to be able to market in the US. So now we know a little more about what the pre-submission is. Let's take a look at the process from a high level, 50,000-foot view. The review process is made up of multiple steps, and each with their own target timeline as determined by the MDUFA 5 requirements. The process begins once a manufacturer submits, and once the manufacturer submits, it goes through an acceptance review. With that being said, then FDA has 15 days to take a look and make the determination of whether you've met the requirements or if they're going to give you an RT, refuse to accept. And with that being said, the timeline does not start with that 15 days. So the goal is to review all pre-subs within 70 days. The 70 days is in addition to the 15. So you want to make sure you get it right the first time. The last thing you want to do is lose more time. The next step, once you've got the acceptance, FDA will send out a letter. Within 30 days, they will reach out to you and set up a meeting. They will try to accommodate your request for the timelines and dates that you gave them. But you will be introduced to your reviewer, and they will open that dialogue. That does not mean to reach out to them with very specific questions about your pre-sub. They will eventually give you their the review and their guidance, but this is solely to set up the meeting. Then after that, FDA has 70 days to review your feedback, or your information, and provide feedback. I know the MDUFA between 2018 and today, the average timeline is about 62 days. However, with that being said, recently I've been seeing it less than that. The past 4 or 5 submissions, we've had FDA reach out to us and provide our feedback within 45 days. So they are accelerating that. But once you receive the feedback from FDA, you make the determination, do I need to still have a meeting? And the meeting isn't to bring more questions to FDA based on the feedback. It's for clarification purposes only. FDA will flat out reject you in the meeting if you ask them, well, we learned this, we want to bring this additional information in, what do you think? This is solely clarification based on the feedback that they have provided you. So with that said, you make the determination, do you need to have that meeting? And I will tell you right now, do not have a meeting with FDA just to get in front of a reviewer and talk to them. If you have something important to say, you need important clarification, something you need to understand, by all means, have that meeting. But if it's outside of that, I do not recommend having that meeting. And if you decide to go ahead with that meeting, FDA will send you their feedback within 5 days of your meeting. You have then 3 days to put slides together on the key points that you want to discuss with FDA during that meeting and get them over. They need the slides 48 hours in advance to be able to get the appropriate people in the review meeting. So, and we'll go through a little more of that later, kind of what's detailed in the meeting. We can go to the next slide. So FDA has listed off examples of appropriate questions, what's not appropriate, and essentially, at the end of the day, FDA wants pointed questions. They want to know and want to understand. They want, very pointed questions. So with that questions, what do you think about this? Open-ended. If the question is not specific to your device but generalized, they don't want to see that. They want to see, do you agree with my testing strategy that we're doing this? Will this meet the requirements based on everything you understand? And they want to see the data to back it up. You can't just say, hey, do you agree that we should do a clinical and we want to put in 120 people? The question has to come from the data that you provided them. They're going to be able to address. They're not looking through your submission to have a holistic understanding of your device. They are on a mission to answer very specific, very pointed questions that you provided them. And so with that, they don't want their time wasted. I have seen so many clients come in with a very generic, what do you think about this? And FDA will slap it down every time. They don't have time for that. Last year alone, there were 3,900 pre-submissions submitted, limited resources. So keep that in mind when you're going through. Also recently, there is a draft guidance that came out with FDA talking about the pre-submission process, and comments just ended, I think, in August for it. One of the things that was noted of importance is that FDA is limiting the number of categories that you can talk about within a pre-submission to 4. That is the maximum that they recommend. So if you want to discuss sterilization and an animal study and a clinical and something else, you're going to have multiple pre-submissions. With that, they've also made the recommendation that you include no more than 7 to 10 questions total. There has been some pushback on that, and the guidance is in draft, but that's their current view. They don't have the time to be able to address 200 questions. They want to be able to answer your 10 and have you move forward. With that being said, they will provide additional feedback if you want a clarification on one of those 10 questions, let's say. But if a question delves into a whole nother segue, they expect a whole new pre-submission for that. With that being said, we can move on to the next slide. So the content. Traditionally, pre-submissions were put together. You had your cover letter, your contact information, your Q-sub, method of feedback, meeting information, and you guys can see all of that. Recently, though, for those of you familiar with the 510K process, FDA has developed the E-Star. With that, they now have something called the Pre-Star, which is a pre-submission E-Star. You'll notice if you've seen the E-Star template, it looks almost identical. It doesn't mean you have to fill out every single aspect of your pre-star, but it's designed in a way to encompass any questions that you may have that you want to present to FDA. And it's also designed, just like the E-Star, to prevent an RTA. So as long as you have filled it out appropriately, provided the adequate information within that submission, and that template is on FDA's website, you will bypass that 15-day acceptance review, which means you get your pre-sub viewed a lot quicker. The Pre-Star itself has all the submission content. It covers the cover letter, the purpose of the pre-submission, any prior regulatory history. That's all listed out in there. It guides you pretty much step by step to make this process as painless as possible. So with that, you have your pre-submission, but they've also got amendments and supplements. And so if FDA does come back and you have questions based on the feedback that FDA has, but those questions aren't relevant to the specific question you asked. Maybe they said something about biocompatibility and now you're wondering about another test. That is when you would submit a supplement. So it's when you've gathered more additional information and you need to, you want to get clarification on that. FDA would recommend doing a supplement then versus an amendment. An amendment at the end of the day is updating your contact information. It is providing meeting minutes with your slides, anything like that. That is where FDA would want to see an amendment going through. So just keep in mind, Supplements aren't used too often, but they can be. And amendments are typically always used because, as we'll get to a little bit later, you are expected to take meeting minutes if you attend the meeting with FDA and provide that, and that is provided as an amendment. So I think we can go on to the next slide. So as we mentioned, if you decide not to do the pre-start, and with that, maybe it's just the process you have in place right now, your SOPs spell out that you have to do it X, Y, and Z, here's your template. I highly recommend taking a look at the guidance and looking at the pre-submission acceptance checklist. FDA uses this to determine whether they are going to accept your review initially. This won't really help you in the back end after they start reviewing, but up front, if you meet all these requirements, you check yes for everything, the likelihood that your submission will be accepted for review drastically increases. So if you aren't sure, do I have what I need? Do I need this? Do I need that? Please take a look at your pre-submission checklist. There is a fantastic walkthrough of that within the guidance. I believe it's under Appendix 1. So FDA, as we mentioned earlier, wants your pre-sub interaction to be on specific focused topics. At the end of the day, they are pulling together their experts to provide you input, and they do not want to have to pull 30 different people from 30 different aspects of the device lifecycle in for a single meeting. Meetings are intended to only be an hour long if you do meet with the FDA, so you're limited on time anyway. So like I said, focused topics, 4 is the maximum, with a recommendation of maybe a max of 10 questions total. And with that, be very, very specific. Do you agree with our biocompatibility approach based on X, Y, and Z? Historically, a predicate device has done this testing. However, we feel it's not appropriate, and we can justify it because of this. Be specific, but with that being said, don't overshare. One tip I can provide is I have seen industry members overshare with FDA. Oh, we'll just throw the book at them, and they'll take a look at everything. No. Not only does FDA not want to see that, you're just giving them more ammunition if there is something wrong or you have a major issue. The FDA works to address your question specifically, so even if there is an issue, they won't necessarily identify it for you. We can move on to the next slide. So some example questions, we just pulled the sterilization and shelf life. Methods for microbiology study program. Are they robust to support sterility assurance? How is this verified? Getting more specific, more granular. Stay away from generic, like I said, open-ended questions. Do you agree with this? Yes or no? We want those it's either A or B. You don't want to give them too much room to run with. I have seen companies that have asked questions that were open-ended. FDA has pretty much thrown the book at them and ran with everything they could because that was what they were given. And companies are really going to hate when they have to spend an extra $200,000 on testing because FDA has made that recommendation because we weren't careful with how pointed our questions were. So in your interactions with FDA, just double check everything, make sure that you are asking specifically what you want to ask, there's no room for interpretation the other way, and that your documentation is there to support it. With that being said, though, the documentation that is there to support, I am of the mindset less is more. And that's because at the end of the day, these pre-subs are subject to the Freedom of Information Act, and short of it being classified or trade secret, competitors can pull off your pre-sub and into the meeting minutes or anything like that within 6 to 9 months, most likely. So less is more, but to the point that you give them the information that they need. And we can move on, and I will pass it over to Anita.
Thank you so much. So we're going to talk a little bit about the pre-sub meeting minutes, and I call them regulatory notes because they're critical to keep. So meeting minutes, the takeaways are submitters are responsible for taking and submitting meeting minutes. So the FDA's expectations is that the submitter would provide the meeting minutes. Also, there shouldn't be any recording of the meeting. That's not allowed. Video recording or voice recording. The agency does not approve of that, so that's not something you want to do. So meeting minutes become even more important. To me, they're regulatory notes. When you submit your meeting minutes to the FDA, you should include a copy of the slides that you presented. I know sometimes people want to update slides, they want to fix typos, but they're really looking for the snapshot of the exact slides that you presented to the agency at that time. Next slide, please. Some of the key areas for meeting minutes is that the meeting minutes need a submission number, the submission type. Is it a pre-submission submission issue request? What is the product name? of the device, who the submitter is, the company name. If you're doing business as, you should include the whole legal company name, the meeting date and time, and the meeting format. Was it in person? Was it virtual? Was it video conference or teleconference? The date of FDA feedback was sent. So if you had some written questions that you submitted prior, you would want to have the date that that FDA feedback was sent to you. The importance more of meeting minutes is it's like a shared document between the agency and the company. So they definitely will look at that to be adequate and accurate. They've had other companies submit them, probably hundreds, maybe thousands, so they know how it should look appropriately. And then one of the other areas I want to talk about is the movement within the agency. From being the pre-approval manager and their global expert for many years, I know that one month I had a division director, I had a reviewer, the next minute they were promoted to branch chief. So these meeting minutes really will help to build that company's history and compliance file.
Can I interject for 1 second?
Sure.
So with your meeting minutes, why it's so critical to take those minutes is that is a record. And you may have a supplement, you may have another pre-submission for the same product if you have too many questions, and FDA will review that, but you may not have the same review team that you currently have. So with that being said, catching them up to speed, looking at their minutes, looking at everything that you provided thus far is really critical to making sure that they can accurately evaluate your device.
Exactly. Thank you so much. Next slide, please. The other area of the meeting minutes is you should have the FDA attendees, the name, the title, and the organization or division they come out of. The company's attendees, the names, the titles, and the company affiliation. The discussion. So a summary of the key questions and decisions. The submitter company affirmed XYZ. What was the question? Your original question that was submitted prior to the physical meeting, and FDA's response should be in it. You also shouldn't include anything that's not covered in the meeting or any tasks that you see as the future or any questions that were not covered. It has to be representative of the pre-submitted meeting that you had. Next slide, please.
I'd like to say I have had clients who have gone into the FDA with, oh, I'm just going to tell them this and I'm going to ask a question to get clarification. FDA does not appreciate that. FDA does remember. And if you waste their time, well, they're the ones approving your product at the end of the day.
Exactly. So, and the other thing is that once you have your meeting is conducted, you have 15 days to submit the meeting minutes or prior, and it becomes an amendment to the submission. So that's how it will be archived or held in the division, and also you should realize that it is a regulatory record.
There's a requirement spelled out in the MDUFA for that, and FDA will take a look at your minutes. They will take 30 days to strike out what they don't agree with, add what they want, and then provide the official final minutes to you afterwards.
Yes.
So it's my turn, I guess.
Hang on.
Yeah, you're good.
So now that we've identified how submitters can target their question to obtain the most valuable feedback, I want to take a second to identify when a pre-submission wouldn't be appropriate. FDA has indicated that questions that fall under the following categories are not suited for pre-submission process. Any administrative questions, review classifications, request for designations, those should actually be submitted under the Office of Combination Products. 513G request for information, which eventually is going to be merged with the pre-start, but it still is not part of the pre-submission. And requests for clarification on device-specific guidance that isn't necessarily related to the product that you're going to market right now. If you're trying to ask about something in the future and you just wanted to get a one-off question, don't. FDA does not want to see that. So next slide. I'll keep this slide brief, but do want to highlight that submitters should be cautious on what information, again, is shared with FDA. I cannot stress enough that less is more, don't overshare. Give them what they need. Giving them the entire book isn't going to make them feel better. They're going to just have an opportunity to tear that apart then. And I will pass it over to Thor.
Okay, so you can go ahead and next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit more on specific when it comes to testing and pre-subs. So we've been involved in a lot of pre-subs at Nelson Laboratories where we've gone through protocols and kind of made sure we had test-specific questions. We've also done our own 510Ks on our approaches to certain test methods. And so we've lived this life. And when people ask me about pre-subs and kind of hints and tricks. The first thing I always tell people, and I know sometimes it's hard to believe, but these FDA reviewers are just human people, okay? So like you put yourself in their situation, okay? The average submission, actually one of my friends from the FDA told me this in CDRH, the average submission is the size of War and Peace novel. And they have to go through those, okay? So think about how much work they're doing, and then you ask for a pre-sub, and you have an annoying one little question that spends a lot of have to spend a lot of time on. So really be, like we talked about, specific, and make sure you kind of get to the point you need to without oversharing. I actually had a customer that came to me after a pre-sub, and they just asked, this is our device, what biocompatibility testing do I need? They did more testing than you would ever believe a device like that needed to be done. So never ask the FDA, what do I need to do to test? You can. I mean, you totally can. It's just you're going to be paying the consequences of that.
I could second that. I've seen that quite a bit.
Yeah. So it's more important to meet with somebody. If you don't have a biocomp expert, they're around. Meet with them, and then you can actually come up with specific questions that help you hone how to set up testing more appropriately. So some of the benefits and disadvantages to a pre-sub. I do want to stress that not always is it great to have a pre-sub. We kind of talked about areas where you don't want to, but I do have to say that the time is long. I have seen it gotten better. Like you said, post-COVID, I think COVID kind of hurt. It's getting better now, but it's still 40, 50 days. And so if you're waiting to do testing based on comments back from the FDA, you got to put that in your timeline. And so if we can make a confident approach through your testing without a pre-sub, that will save you time.
I
Okay?
would like to say that the best time for a pre-sub is now, yesterday, or now, you know.
I always say the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, right? So you got to think about that in your timelines with a pre-sub. If you're really wanting, if you have a device that you're not sure the direction, we need to prepare for it, do it, but get it done quickly because this is all taking time away from getting things to the market. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is it used for from a testing specific point of view? We really want, it kind of talked about it, Jordan kind of talked about it a little bit, but we want to be specific in the test protocol. A good example of what we use pre-subs for is extractables and leachable testing. That's not a standardized test, and there's a lot of, I'm going to say, differences within the FDA based on your reviewer on how they want to see it. Okay. Now remember, these are non-binding results. So it is technically possible that when you get a feedback from your pre-sub and you do the testing, that there could be some issues that the FDA is now seeing that they're changing their mind. But I have seen times where we've gotten feedback from the FDA on a pre-sub. We did the testing, which is a pretty long test. We submitted, and then the FDA had issues. And then we gave them the pre-sub and said, but you guys told us this is the approach. And they said, okay, that's fine now, but next time do it this other way, right? So we have, even though it's non-binding, in my experience, we've seen the FDA hold true to the results. That's why it's so important to have things written down clearly and having the names of the people involved.
We like to tell our clients it's unofficially written in stone.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. So the FDA will tell you it's non-binding, but we have seen them hold true to it in our experience. But the E&L, extractables and leachable testing, is a good example where we go in, we talk about solvents, or we want to be very specific in that test method. We don't want to say, how do we run extractable leachables for this device? Because then, once again, you're opening yourself up to the worst case test method. Next slide. Okay, so why, when, and how are we submitting pre-subs? This is based on our experience, right? So they do provide timely written guidance for the evaluation of medical device. There are a lot of unpublished internal FDA policies, and this is why we do a pre-sub, because you would think you'd be able to reach out to someone like us, and we'd be able to tell you exactly what the FDA is looking for your device. I've been 23 years in this industry. I've done tons of submissions. You would think that I would be able to wake up from my sleep and be able to tell you exactly what your device needs. Unfortunately, that's not how this works, right? We can give you the best guidance based on that experience, and we do submissions every day. Our clients do, right? So we can give you the most up-to-date, but this is where the pre-sub helps. If there's an ambiguity in our decision, we can get clearance.
Substantial equivalence does not mean identical, and so the testing doesn't always go across the board. That's something important to keep in mind.
Yeah, and then ultimately, the best time to do this is before we start testing. I've had some people say, okay, we feel confident, but we just want to hear it, but let's start the testing and we'll do a pre-sub. And that always scares me. No matter how confident we are, sometimes it's better to ask forgiveness than permission. And so they may want to see something that we haven't put in the protocol, and if we already started testing, we might have to redo again. So sometimes you might want to save time by doing them in parallel, but there's some danger there, just so you know. Okay, so do you have anything else, Jordan? Yeah.
Just a couple things. So with FDA, one of the clarifications in their guidance document about questions and pointed questions you can ask them, take a look at your questions. Now, we've already talked about are they appropriate, but does one question inform another? FDA kind of wants you to avoid doing that. Get this question clarified and then move on, because if that question is going to impact later on your testing, maybe you have to submit a second pre-submission then, but they can't give you definitive guidance if it depends on more variables than they can take into account at the current pre-submission.
And I will just say, make sure you're very upfront with what you want to ask them when you're setting it up, because I've been involved with these where we want to talk about a specific test, and the company didn't do the best job on informing the FDA what the specifics were going to be, and they didn't have the right SMEs in place. So it was a wasted pre-sub for us because we were asking questions, and the reviewers is like, well, we're going to have to check with the SME. So we need the right people in the room when we're having these discussions.
So I kind of talked about the horror stories of pre-subs. Pre-subs are really useful, and I encourage them for almost every submission. There are obviously some submissions which aren't applicable. But with that being said, once again, I want to provide an example of where we should have been more specific. We had a client that came to us, was having regulatory issues with another consultant, and we took a look at their pre-sub questions, and one of the questions is, what does FDA recommend for our de novo pathway? Well, that just opens up everything. And FDA, it's a de novo. They don't know a lot about your device because it's only what you provided thus far. You maybe haven't done a lot of testing. All of a sudden, they start adding requirements and regulations right and left that you didn't even think of, or that aren't really relevant to the safety of your device, but you can't paint that out for them because they're working on the information they have. So be very pointed. This client ended up, it was a nightmare, let's put it that way. Hundreds of thousands of dollars of extra testing.
Any questions for us about pre-subs or anything else we can help with?
You can't record the meeting, you can't audio or video, but with AI and the invention there, you got a lot of transcribing and summarizing of notes that don't actually capture a recording. It just listens and summarizes the meeting. It's extremely helpful. Has FDA made any comment on that in your experience?
So I would say, if there's not a lot of information, but I'll throw it to you, but I would say that they don't want an exact copy of the minutes. They want summaries, and they want the key areas that were covered during that meeting.
Outcomes, anything there were agreements on, anything that they can go back and reference later.
Any kind of tasks that are in there that you spoke of, any regulatory advice you have for a pathway that you're thinking of. There are also, with some of the pre-sub meetings now, they look at proposed changes in the future that you might make under a PCCP program. So you want to bring all that to the table. And I know you're going back to AI, but if you have if you've appointed, per the guidance, if you've appointed a good SME to take the meeting notes, you should be adequate. I think you might have to explain that if you did use AI to take all of it, and it might lead that's like a verbal recording, or in some form of a recording.
Wrongly recommend not, and I don't want to get too much into the legal area, but it kind of falls into the jurisdiction of wiretapping laws and what states are single-party consent states and what aren't. So, recording, you can't record somebody if they're in a dual-party consent state. And so with that, I mean, it's not been fully defined by the regulations yet, but I would be very careful with that.
So I actually had 2 clients that asked the FDA if brought in the pre-sub. They said, they usually say no recording, whatever. And they said, oh, we have a transcription up and going. And the FDA both times asked them to not transcribe. So there is no guidance, but the FDA in both of these times said no. There was another, yes.
So I'm curious about when you get the written feedback from the FDA, you mentioned that you don't always want to have the in-person meeting. So what do you look, when you get that written feedback, what in it are you seeing like, oh, now I need the in-person meeting?
So I actually had this a couple weeks ago. We got clarification on everything. I mean, it didn't all break our way, but we understood what the requirements are. It wasn't ambiguous. There was no question about whether we needed to do X, Y, or Z testing. I mean, they told us verbatim what we needed to do. And at that point in time, I mean, we could get the reviewer in just to see their face, but they're just going to annoy them and waste their time. So it's things like that. If you want a clarification question or you want to understand how they came to a conclusion so you can better, apply it moving forward, that would be appropriate.
Yeah, I'll just give you I know we're out of time, so I'll give you a real life question. We wanted to know if we could not use a certain surface area for a test. And so we said, can we use this surface area for the test? And the FDA wrote back and said no. But we wanted to kind of know why that was. And so then we had to and talk to the expert. But if they would have said yes or said no because of this, then we probably would have been okay. Do we have time for
One more.
Okay, yeah.
This is more of a comment than a question. When you're talking about meetings with the FDA on Q-subs, less is also more.
Yes.
You don't need to have, if you're asking a question about a biocompatibility strategy that you're proposing, you don't need your corporate attorneys or senior vice presidents. So from industry, if you're having meetings, have as few people as possible, make it reasonable. Make who you have there too, but don't overwhelm.
Yeah, once again, treat them as people. Like if you imagine sitting down and there's like 20 people and they're all having comments and things, as a reviewer, you might get a little frustrated with that.
That's a great comment because I have seen people bring 20 people to this virtual FDA meeting and none of them spoke except for one. Bring the experts for the questions and the clarifications that you want where you can talk about that. Other than that, the project lead or if you're CEO, if you're a smaller company, leave it, you're right, less is more.
One thing I'd also like to add is you have to also give them time to answer the questions. So I've been at pre-sub meetings and for devices and also for drugs where it's just a long talking and you have so many experts there at times that can provide the information. So really give the agency time to discuss and to give you the answer, allow for time for that.
I'll leave this just as I had a client recently. FDA doesn't care about your backstory or life story. They want the facts about the device, and they want to move on at the end of the day. They don't care that you're a physician and you've seen 500 patients doing X, Y, and Z. They want to know your device. They want to answer your questions and move on because, like I said, last year there were 3,900 different pre-subs. They got to move on to the next one.
Thank you.